right. Hi, everybody. Andy Larson with you again. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you're new, to the 2017 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series, hosted by University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farms team. I'm Andy. I'm up in northwestern Illinois. We're going to be talking with Zack Grant, one of my colleagues today. We appreciate you joining us for these webinars, and we know it's a tight time frame. We'll keep it in the lunch hour. Please stick your questions in the chat box, and we will get to them as the time allows. Anything that Zack doesn't see, I will point out to him towards the end. As I mentioned, this presentation is being recorded, and you will all receive a link to the archived presentation on the Illinois Local Foods YouTube channel shortly after we conclude here today. If you're having audio issues, you can't hear me right now, but I put a few suggestions over on the left. Hopefully that's helping people out. Usually signing out and logging back in is the fastest way to get most of your fixes made. All right. With that, this week's presentation is from Zack Grant. Zack is a local food systems and small farms educator in Cook County. He's got degrees from Illinois State and University of Illinois, and he has spent a number of years just before he came on as an extension educator managing the Student Sustainable Farm at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, which is kind of a living laboratory for getting started in small commercial vegetable production. He has since moved up to the good old city and is focusing a lot on urban agriculture. And one of the areas he's found some interest in recently, a lot of interest in recently, is microgreens production. So with that, Zack, I'm going to let you take it away, sir.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Andy, for the great introduction. For those of you who don't know me, I am currently up in Cook County. I am currently specializing in urban ag production, education, outreach, and training. And before, like Andy mentioned, I was down at the student farm down on our main campus in Champaign-Urbana. And down there we did do some pilot production runs for commercial scale microgreen production. And I am actually currently in the process of doing a small side business pilot myself, focusing on pea and sunflower shoots. And I'm not going to talk specifically about that, but we will talk about pea and sunflower shoots. So with that being said, I really want to jump in because we have a lot to cover and I want to leave time for questions. So today we're going to talk about small-scale commercial microgreen production. We're going to go over, what microgreens are for those of you who don't know what it is, how we differentiate microgreens from sprouts because that's important for a number of different contexts. We're going to look at all the components of a microgreen system. And then we're going to look at some commercial production models, and then we'll finally close with some food safety points that you should be considering, as well as looking at some different marketing models. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. So what are microgreens for those of you that don't know? Here's a picture that I just took the other day for one of my pilot projects under a fluorescent light system, indoor light system that I'm experimenting with, of kohlrabi microgreens. So any seed that you grow out in the garden, typically for salad greens or herbs, can be considered a microgreen as well. And really it's just an edible seedling where you're harvesting that particular variety at the cotyledon or 1 to 3 true leaf stage, where the true leaf stage is when it starts to look like a plant. We'll look at a differentiation of that in the next slide. They're not sprouts. Sprouts are grown under super moist conditions, and you're eating the whole plant, including the seed coat. And there's some reasons why we should differentiate sprouts from microgreens, and we'll discuss that in a couple slides. They're typically harvested on a much shorter time scale than their more mature counterparts. So we're talking real quick turnaround times, 1 to 3 weeks, depending. So these kohlrabi microgreens that you see here on the right, these are actually about, I want to say, 14 days old, and they're well overdue for harvesting. There are some true leaves in there, we'll see in the next slide, and they're ready to go. But you can harvest them as early as 7 days, and at the later end 3 weeks, but typically around 1 to 2 weeks is when they are typically harvested. They're used in soups, salads, smoothies, or really any replacement that you can think of where you would use greens in their more mature context, you can use microgreens as well. And we'll talk about marketing a little bit more towards the end. So again, here's just another sort of way of differentiating a microgreen from its more mature counterpart. So let's take an example like arugula, for instance. Arugula can be grown at all these different stages. You could grow arugula sprouts, where if you're harvesting them as sprouts, you're harvesting them when they just germinate with the emerging root or radicle, and you're harvesting the seed coat and root and eating all that component. If you're growing arugula microgreens, then you're growing them out a little bit longer, 2 to 3 inches in height, 7 to 21 days, and you're harvesting the stem, cotyledons, and the true leaves. And that distinction is important between those two, and we'll look at that in a few slides. But if you could further grow it out, right? In the garden, we grow arugula as baby greens, and then we can also grow them as mature greens. So there's nothing that really differentiates an arugula seed from a microgreen seed. It's really just how the growth stage that we're harvesting that particular seed at. Sprout, microgreen stage, baby green stage, more mature green stage counterpart. So microgreens we're harvesting right at that 7 to 21 day stage. So here's a picture of, on the left, the purple kohlrabi microgreens that you saw, and then on the right, that's a red purple radish. So here you can kind of differentiate what the difference between a cotyledon and a true leaf is. So the cotyledons emerge first, and the cotyledons, when you look in the top of this picture, the arrows are pointing towards those sort of B or number 8 shaped leaves, and you can see in both kohlrabi and radish the cotyledons are identical. Okay, so those are the energy stores that the seeds rely on just after they germinate. The true leaves, if you look at the bottom, the arrows are pointing on the left to the kohlrabi true leaf stage, and on the right the radish stage. So that's where they start to differentiate from the cotyledons and start to look like their more mature counterpart. So again, both of these varieties are in this picture about 14 to 15 days old, which is about the upper end where most people normally grow commercial microgreens out before they actually harvest for sale. Beyond this, then you start to get into the more, considering baby leaf stage for these varieties, and we're normally growing them out in outdoor beds or in different contexts. So this is just a picture so you can see the difference between what a cotyledon and true leaf stage is. Marketing microgreens, they're harvested at both of these stages, cotyledon and true leaf stage. So you often hear about shoots. What are shoots? In my opinion, and from a marketing standpoint, shoots really are just bigger microgreens. If you follow Curtis Stone, the urban farmer, a lot of his YouTube videos, he talks about microgreen production on his urban farm, but the microgreens that he grows are typically pea shoots and sunflower shoots, but he calls them microgreens. So to avoid confusion, you often hear pea shoots, sunflower shoots, these larger seeded varieties of microgreens marketed as microgreens, but people also call them shoots, so they're kind of interchangeable. And the idea is that they're grown the same as microgreens, but usually the seeds are much larger, usually with peas and sunflowers and nasturtiums and popcorn, we're actually soaking the seed overnight usually, whereas the smaller seed, the Brassiaceae family microgreens, you don't typically soak the seed, although you can overnight. And then we're often, here in this case, you see the pea shoots, we're seeding them at a real high density here. You can see this is actually, with pea shoots, we'll look at seed densities later, this is actually about 11 to 12 ounces per 10 by 20 flat. So again, shoots are the same thing as microgreens. They're just usually bigger microgreens, bigger seeds, and to avoid confusion, you can market them as microgreens, but you could also call them shoots too. So for those of you who didn't know the difference, I just kind of wanted to illuminate that a little bit. So why would we grow microgreens? This is often, a lot of questions people ask. At the base level, they're really fun and easy to grow. So for home gardeners, they can fill that gap for winter blues. You could grow microgreens under a light bench system or under a sunny windowsill in your house 12 months out of the year. And then, so during the winter months, if we're not doing season extension, microgreens can fill that sort of winter blues gap for your home gardener. For a commercial gardener, the attractive thing about microgreens is that there's a real quick crop turnover time and potentially a quick return on investment, because you can get started up really quickly, and there's a high gross per square foot and and you can really quickly realize some high margins and some high gross profits if you have the right market. So they can be produced year round. So could be an extension of your existing marketing plan and another enterprise that you add to enhance cash flow year round, because you can grow these year round and market them. Superfood. So there's a lot of studies out there, and I've actually been reviewing a few over the past couple weeks related to sprouts and microgreens, and how they're at that smaller, the cotyledon and early true leaf stage, they're super rich in minerals, phytonutrients, and secondary plant metabolites. One of the most famous one of those secondary plant metabolites is the hydrolysis byproduct of glucoraphanin, which is called sulforaphane, which has a lot of these anti-carcinogenic properties. There's been some research done on sprout equivalent brassica family members where that secondary plant metabolite is up to 4 to 6 times more dense in that smaller stage product, as opposed to their more mature counterpart. So there's, this isn't something that is necessarily an FDA certified label that you can put on there, but there is a lot of research going out there right now where you can use this information to educate your consumer about how these are a superfood, and they are providing a lot of phytonutrients and minerals even at that really small condensed stage. In terms of sale price, they retail for up to $1 an ounce. So if you go to Whole Foods and you're buying microgreens or sprouts, up to $1 per ounce. They only cost about a quarter per ounce to produce. Now I don't have all the breakdown for that. That's a real quick calculation that I put together. But you can see there's some margin there. There's some potential profit margin, even when you take into account the retailer markup to grow microgreens and market these and realize some good margins. They're a real high gross per square foot crop, up to even $25 per square foot, depending on the varieties that you're growing and your end user or your market that you're selling to. The other nice thing about microgreens from a local food niche perspective is that microgreens are really highly perishable. So growers who in California who might be growing these in a large scale warehouse, indoor vertical farm, or hydroponic operation that are trying to market microgreens in the Midwest, the problem is they're so perishable that they don't, like rough handling or bruising or even too much washing and handling, and it reduces their shelf life. So if you can develop a local niche with microgreens, you can produce a much higher quality crop that's going to have a higher shelf life, and you can get to the end user much quicker. So there is a potential advantage there in terms of local food marketing versus the more global food system for microgreens. So let's talk about sprouts versus microgreens. And this is an important distinction, and I actually have some really relevant sort of just-in-time information about this related to the FDA guidance document with the Produce Safety Alliance, and specifically the Sprout Safety Alliance, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But the key takeaway here in that first bullet is that microgreens are not sprouts, and the FDA actually recognizes that microgreens are not sprouts, which is something up until just a few weeks ago it was unclear whether that's the case, and you'll see why in the next slide. Sprouts, we talked about the growth stage difference, but sprouts are grown in jars or in these large-scale germination chambers without soil. They require lots of water, high humid, high moisture environment, and typically very low light. So these are prime conditions for pathogen spread, and there's been a number of documented outbreaks related to sprouts, specifically with Listeria, E. coli, and salmonella that we hear so much about in the news. So people, they hear microgreens, they think sprouts, but really there is a difference, and this is something that you really need to educate your consumers on about the difference between the two to avoid this confusion. So again, sprouts, you're eating the actual root, the first, what they call the radicle that emerges from the seed itself, the stem, cotyledons, and the seed hulls. Okay, and sometimes the contamination can come from the seed hulls themselves. Whereas with microgreens, the seed hulls are expelled, and you're not actually harvesting the root or the seed hull. So that's what really differentiates the two. Microgreens, you're only eating the stem and the leaves and cotyledons above the soil line. So that's different. And microgreens are usually grown in a soil-like, soilless, or in hydroponic media with air, circulation, and light. So there's less risk of pathogen spread and contamination, and there actually have been no documented outbreaks related to microgreens yet. So when we look at the research in terms of of this food safety issues, sprouts versus microgreens. There's just not a lot of research out there yet because there haven't really been any documented cases of microgreens. So again, I say less risk of pathogen spread or contamination. You still need to apply good agricultural practices, and we'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. But sprouts are not microgreens. Big takeaway from this slide. So here's the new guidance as of January of 2017 from the FDA. So I'm sure a lot of the people on the call next week, we're going to be talking about food safety. But the Food Safety Modernization Act, under the produce safety rule under FSMA, there's actually this subpart called Subpart M that specifically relates to sprouts. Okay, and in their new guidance document the FDA just released, they in the highlighted orange sections in here, they actually have distinguished microgreens from sprouts, because just like we talked about before, in terms of the growth stage and the parts that we're actually harvesting, they consider them to be different, and therefore growers who are growing microgreens and not sprouts are not subject to the requirements of Subpart M of the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. And that is super important, because those of you who have looked, or those of you who may be sprouts growers who are familiar with Subpart M, realize that sprout growers have to go above and beyond just the regular produce safety standards in terms of environmental testing for listeria and high quality of water and wastewater testing if you're in a recirculating system for sprout production. So, this equals to doing swab tests on countertops, these are tests and records that very large-scale food processing facilities have to keep. So there's some rigorous regulations now associated with FSMA specifically about sprouts. So it's important that they made this distinction between microgreens and sprouts. So I just wanted to clarify that. If you want more information about this, you can look up the Sprout Safety Alliance, which is actually at the Illinois Institute of Technology, the iFish Center, which is located here in Cook County. So if you want more information about sprouts and what we're talking about here, I would look up the Sprout Safety Alliance for those of you interested in sprout production. But we'll talk about a little bit more food safety as we get towards the end. So let's talk about the different components of a microgreen system. So we'll start with seeds. Again, like I said, the microgreen seeds are the same as their larger version. There isn't anything that distinguishes a microgreen arugula seed from a regular arugula seed that you would grow out in the garden. It's just the stage that you're harvesting at. The one distinction, though, is that when you start to scale this up, you need a lot of seed. So instead of buying like a 1/4 ounce of arugula seed for your outdoor production, you're buying 5 to 10 pounds of arugula seed at once. So that's important because of production costs later on. So I said, relatively quick ROI and not as much money to get in started with microgreen production, but the seeds can be expensive, so that's an important distinction to make. Some companies have pre-mixed blends for better uniformity, so we'll look at a couple of those, and that's a really good place to start if you're just kind of experimenting with getting into microgreens. Growing these pre-mixed blends, they're usually like a mild mix or spicy mix blends from Johnny's or High Mowing Seeds or some companies like that, where you can just kind of get a feel for how microgreens work and experiment with before you start really differentiating or specializing in specific seeds. They're usually untreated. You want them untreated, so you don't want microgreen seeds or their mature counterparts that have a fungicide that's applied to it. That's important because those residuals could potentially get on to the leaf because the fungicide is actually applied to the seed. So make sure they're untreated. They're ideally lot tested for pathogens the same way that sprout seeds are, but this isn't always the case. So sprout seeds, when you look at seed catalogs, are usually lot tested for E. coli and salmonella on the seed coat itself, because like I said, with sprout production, that's actually a source of contamination, the seed hull itself. So they're not all lot tested. Sometimes they may or may not be. You could get them lot tested when you are really scaled up, but that's down the road. Lot code on packets, that's important for record keeping and tracking seed germination and other records. So we'll talk about germination testing once you are doing this and you have a lot of seed that you've purchased. and you're not using it all in one year, you might want to do lot testing, germination testing. So it's important to keep track of information on the package itself. Some seeds we are pre-soaking. So we talked about the peas and sunflowers. You could ubiquitously, depending on how you're seeding your flats or your system, you could pre-soak all of your seeds, but definitely the larger seeds, if you pre-soak them overnight, it definitely helps. Sanitizing seeds, if pathogens and not pathogens of public health concern are a concern, then that might be something that you might look into doing. There's DIY ways of doing it. The Curtis Stone, he method for his sunflower and pea shoots is to do the homemade peroxyacetic acid, which is just white vinegar and food grade hydrogen peroxide, soaks it in it for 10 minutes and then soaks them overnight. Now there are commercial versions of peroxyacetic acid like Tsunami 100, but the important thing is that typically Tsunami, they're labeled to control, here in quotes you see at the bottom, seed-borne microorganisms that cause plant disease or spoilage, and not pathogens of public health concern. So there are some seed treatments, if you really want to really minimize your risk and you want to treat all of your microgreen seeds before you put them into your system, there are ways to do that. And if you actually look at the FDA guidance document for the subpart M for sprouts, they talk about different methods. So there's like hot water treatments and things like that you can do to essentially sterilize your seeds and reduce the risk if you're really concerned with that. But a lot of growers don't do that, but they do sanitize the seeds because of potential seed-borne microorganisms that could cause spoilage or early decay, like damping off and things like that. So that's another consideration for your microgreen seeds. Good varieties. So there's definitely a lot of different things you can do. The fast and easy we have listed here, a lot of the brassica family stuff, arugula, kales, Asian greens. Some more challenging ones are definitely like the herbs, the basil, dill, cilantros, because sometimes the germination times are much longer. Amaranth, the Chenopodiaceae family, beets, Swiss chards. So they can be done, but they're just a little bit more challenging. And like I said, there's definitely companies that have these mixes and different comparison charts of microgreens that they offer in larger quantities for you to purchase. So, we're not endorsing either of these vendors here, but Johnny's and High Mowing both have, spicy and mild micro mixes that would be a mixture of brassica family stuff, all mixed together with similar germination rates, so you can, have a real uniform germination and growth pattern with your microgreen flat, just to kind of get started and experiment. And then you could differentiate, if you're working with chefs who want specific varieties, then you could start experimenting with specific varieties after you kind of get your feet wet with microgreen production. So that's a good place to start, is the pre-mixed blends that some of the companies offer. But
Can
again,
you say what you mean by more challenging, Zach?
Well, I gave the example of cilantro or parsley or herb microgreens that you would be harvesting at a smaller stage. Those, if you've never grown parsley or cilantro, those have typically longer germination times, right? Whereas, the brassica family crops, those things, as soon as you seed those, they pop in 2 days and you have a crop in 7 days. So in terms of timing and scheduling and getting germination and soil temperatures right, it can be a little bit more challenging for some of those more specific sort of specialty greens. So I wouldn't, if you're working with a chef who says, I want you to grow a bunch of purple orac or amaranth microgreens for me, and you've never grown either of those things, you may want to start with something that's simple, like the pre-blended mixes, just to get a feel for how the system works, and then kind of slowly experiment with some of these specialty greens, trial some of the specialty greens before you buy 15 pounds of purple orac seed, which could cost $186. You see, so
Gotcha.
That's what I mean, is that you just kind of work in slow in terms of how you're actually trying to try out some of these specific greens. So I mentioned germination testing. So the fact that we're purchasing so much seed, up to 5 to 10 pounds at a time, might mean that even if we did all our planning correctly, we might have some leftover seed every single year. So it's important to keep track of the lot codes and germination rates and dates on those packages, and then also do some germination testing yourself in season, or at the end of the season, or something like that. So here's just an example of the paper towel method that I've used in the past with the student farm. I actually even know that some seed companies use a similar method where you pull out a certain number, maybe 10 seeds of a variety, label the paper towel with a Sharpie. So, in the case we were using alphanumeric codes, A1, A2, so on and so forth. Couple that with a spreadsheet, and then just roll them up, keep them misted in a little Tupperware container like that, and just after a couple days, you should see the germination rates. And if they start dipping below 80%, then you could either double the rates or start to look to replace that seed. But ideally, because the seed is so expensive, you want to get just the amount that you need and try not to get much more because you're purchasing such large quantities versus your normal outdoor production. But if you store them properly, microgreen can, cold and dry, microgreen seed can last 3 to 5 years. I mean, I have some leftover stuff from 2 to 3 years ago that's still getting high germination rates, and I'm still using. But it's good to do some in year and end of the year germination testing just to make sure that the seed is still viable. So in terms of seeding rates, now there's a lot of variability here. The place that most of us start is this third bullet down is seeding rates by eye, where you're typically looking for, a 1/4 inch or 6 to 8 seeds per square inch for larger seeds, and maybe 10 to 12 seeds per square inch for smaller seeds. Now I'm not saying get out, a square inch ruler and go down there and count 10 to 12 seeds per square inch, but kind of just get a feel for that early on when you're doing this by eye. You might be putting it into a cup and then just sprinkling it onto the surface of your media. That could be a good place to start. Where growers actually, once they refine their system, start moving towards is more seeding weights by rate. So that's the second bullet, where for maybe small seeds it might be 3 grams per 10 by 20 tray. For the medium-sized seeds, 10 to 15 grams per 10 by 20 tray. In Curtis Stone's book, the fourth bullet under by weight, he has it really dialed in, where for larger shoot types like peas and sunflowers, for the sunflowers he's doing exactly 6 ounces of seed per 10 by 20 tray and exactly 11 ounces per 10 by 20 tray for peas. So once you experiment with this a little bit and do some trials with your varieties and what you want to grow for your markets, you'll get a better idea of what you need. And eventually a by weight system per 10 by 20 tray or per whatever media or system that you're using is where you eventually go to. You could also do it by volume. So I've seen, 1 tablespoon per flat, 10 by 20 flat for brassica. So there are a bunch of different ways that you can do it. You typically start off doing it by eye, just eyeing it, but you eventually move to a by weight seeding rate, which is what I would recommend once you really get your systems refined. So it's not exact. You need to do some trials and to dial it in to your specific situation and context. So there are some things out there. So that you're going to see a slide a little bit later on, in that top upper right corner. This is actually something that was designed as a capstone project by a grad student. I found this on Flickr. Where he created a seed hopper system with a bar, very similar to the pinpoint seeder that you see in Johnny's, but for microgreens, where he puts the seed in the hopper and it's a hand roller where he rolls it across the surface of the media, and there's an even distribution of seed density across the media. In this case, they're using a white felt pad you see in the bottom right corner. There isn't anything like this on the market right now. This was, like I said, a research project, but I wouldn't be surprised if down the road, because we're starting to see some specialty harvest equipment for small scale growers for microgreens, if we see some seeding equipment very similar to what you see in the upper right hand corner here. I don't have a link to this Flickr page. If you just look on Flickr in the commons pictures for microgreen stuff, you might find this guy and you could track him down if you want and see if he has blueprints for it. But again, there's nothing a commercial hand seeder out there yet for flats, but I wouldn't be surprised if something comes out in the market. Although once you get the by weight per tray or per growing media down, that might actually, there might not be a market for it because the by weight seeding density is actually pretty accurate once you fully develop it. So let's talk about trays. We're going to talk about systems a little bit later, but typically where most people get into this is usually in sort of a 10 by 20 flat system or a 10 or 20 row open cedar flat system like you see here in the left picture on the right. And then typically we're the top tray has drainage holes, and we're putting it into a tray that doesn't have drainage holes and collect that runoff or be used for bottom watering. So the thing I want you to notice here is that if you can get the specialty trays where they're 1 inch to 1.5 inches or 1 inch and 3/8 of an inch deep, that's better because that's really all the growing media that you need. You don't really need the larger trays that have actually 2 inches of depth. If you put 2 inches of media in that tray, you're wasting that media. pretty much even the larger pea shoots really only need about 1 inch or 1.5 inches of media for their life cycle. They don't need much more than that. So if you're starting a new system and you want to order trays for this, I would recommend these 1 to 1.5 inch deep trays rather than the regular trays that are about 2 inches deep. So in terms of growing media, there's two schools of thought with growing medium. So there's the what I would call the nutrient dense versus the not nutrient dense camp, and I'm kind of somewhere right in the middle. It's important because media choice is one of the largest costs of production next to seeds. Okay, so you're running anywhere from $1.50 to $4 per tray in terms of production costs. So it's important to find what I would call the highest quality media at the lowest price point that has maybe just a little bit of fertility into it. So you're not wanting to use your Vermont Compost Company Fort V mix for microgreen production, because that's the media you use for your transplants that get those transplants to like 48 days in some cases. You might want to use just like a organic pro mix or something like that has like a soy-based organic fertilizer that will get the seedlings just to maybe like a couple weeks. So highest quality media at the lowest price point with some fertility is a good place to start if you're going to go the soilless media route. The microgreens that you're growing up to 2 weeks, they need very little nutrients. If you're going to that first true leaf stage, 15 to 21 days, those microgreens definitely benefit from a little bit more availability and seed spacing if you can get it into there. So the post-planting fertilization is usually what's done if you're doing it in a hydroponic or a soilless system. You can do it in a soil or soil-based media system, but it's likely not necessary if you have a little bit of fertility in the mix itself. You definitely want to avoid smelly fertilizers like fish emulsions, because that can definitely cause some sensory issues and taste issues, and I would avoid those fertilizers at all costs. Typically from the organic side, if you're going to be doing this organically, you just want to get a media that has some fertility in it. If you're doing it hydroponically and you want to use an in quote organic post-planting fertilization scheme, you're going to have to find, and there are things out there besides fish emulsion that you can use in an organic context. So if you're using media like a soilless media or compost-based media, you could technically reuse that media if you dry it out and then reinvigorate it with compost, but I would not recommend that on a commercial scale because of the potential for disease spread. And again, media choice is one of the larger costs of production, but if you're only $1.50 per tray, when you're charging $15-$20 per tray is a small amount to avoid some of the potential pitfalls with reusing media. So I would just compost your reused media and start anew. Some people do reinvigorate their media, but I would start new.
Considerations regarding FSMA and your media?
Let me get to that at the end.
Right.
With FSMA, that's a whole other thing in terms of biological soil amendments of animal origin. So you just want to make sure that you're in compliance with, in terms of if it's a manure-based media that you're using, to make sure that the manure has been adequately composted or a recognized treatment process in that case. So that's what I would say about that. If I can think of anything else at the end, we can talk a little bit more about that. Felt pad hydroponic production. So in hydroponic systems where you're not using a soil media at all, there are growers who are just growing right on these felt pads. So here's a picture of one on the left, and this is a compostable felt pad where you just put the seeds directly on the felt pad, apply water, either bottom or overhead, and then a little bit of fertility in it, not a lot, and you're growing it directly on the felt pad, and then you harvest it, and then you compost the felt pad. On the right, this is a picture I took from an urban hydroponic greenhouse operation in Chicago, where they're using that FarmTech fodder system. So FarmTech sells this fodder system where you can grow, grass in a hydroponic setup that you feed to your ruminant animals, and they purchased that and actually are using that for microgreen production. So you can see that here. They're just germinating the seeds on those felt pads and putting it in the trough system for this hydroponic system that FarmTech sells. But there's a bunch of different ways you can do this, float trays, there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. So hydroponic production is definitely possible, but this is something, and we're going to talk about this at the very end, this is the last point, is that if you're looking to get into this cheaply and quickly, unless you're already doing hydroponic production, you really need to look at, your startup costs. If you think, oh, I don't want to use soil and I just want to start a new project, I'm going to do it hydroponically. You really need to look at your cost of production and return on investment before you do that, versus, starting as an add-on to your existing operation, or there are some other indoor method systems that you can do that aren't as high-tech as this, but it is possible. So I just wanted to show you what those medias look like in a hydroponic context. So light and temperature considerations, ideal soil temperature. For most of the varieties that you're growing, 73 to 75. Ideal air temperature, 70 to 75. So those are ideal. Okay, but microgreens don't go through their whole life cycle, so less than ideal conditions won't have a huge impact. And in fact, in the greenhouse systems, I've seen microgreens tolerate temperatures up to 100 degrees and as cold as 40 degrees in the winter. You can still get some decent germination if you have a heat table. So there you can have some fluctuations. Those are the ideal temperatures, but again, they're not going through their whole life cycle, so less than ideal conditions won't have a huge impact. In terms of light, if you're doing this purely indoor and you're not doing it in a greenhouse, then you need to have some considerations for light. So the larger scale operations are definitely moving to the LED systems, which work really well if you want to invest into it. But you can just start with the basic T12 or T8 fluorescent grow bulbs, like you see here on the right. So this is just a system. I purchased a 6-tray system from Johnny's. You could build your own. There's a lot of different ways you can get into it. The key is with the fluorescent systems that you're keeping the light tubes 2 to 3 inches from the plants, and have some ability to move that light up and down with growth, because you need to keep those fluorescents really close, or else they're going to stretch, just like with transplant production. So indoor, it's a little bit easier to regulate temperatures, because that idea 70 to 75 is kind of close to where we're keeping our indoor temperatures if we're doing it in a basement or in a spare room in our house anyway. If you're moving up to the sort of warehouse systems or modular sort of storage container systems, you might need to integrate some air conditioning in there and air circulation and filtration to regulate the temperatures and good high quality air into that facility. With a lot of these people, a lot of folks are doing greenhouse production of microgreens because they're just adding it on to their existing sort of transplant production greenhouse system as a way to use that bench space when they're not growing transplants. So with that, you don't need to worry as much about light because you're getting usually full sun. Obviously, if your greenhouse is situated in an ideal spot, if you're not using bench space in the summer and it's getting too hot, you might want to consider shade cloth, because microgreens can tolerate some shade. So water, obviously water access is a must. Frost-free water, if you're doing a greenhouse production system, is an absolute must as well if you're going to be doing year-round production in a greenhouse or a transplant greenhouse. Using pathogen-free or the highest quality water or potable water is important. If we're using the FSMA standard, 0 coliform forming units, CFUs or MPNs of generic E. coli is what you would ideally be using. That's the same standard for the sprout water, same standard for post-harvest washing of water. But if you're using city water, it's already usually tested and treated, so it's less risky. But if you're using groundwater or you want to use your surface water, you should test it and make sure that it's coming out with 0 generic E. coli as a quantitative measure and not a qualitative measure. So an actual measurement of the units of E. coli. So make sure water isn't pooling in your growing space is important. You could do hand watering. There are automated overhead sprinkler systems. I prefer bottom watering once you get established to reduce some of the fungal and mildew issues that could happen if you don't have good air circulation because of such close spacing. If you keep those leaf surfaces wet, you can run some risk for some fungal and mildew issues. But each microgreen variety is different and they might have different watering needs. So really the watering needs are kind of based on practice and experience. Just like with transplant production in the greenhouse, watering is one of the highest skill sets that you need. It's the same thing with microgreen production. So you just need to do some practice. So here, I'm just going to go really quickly go over a very simplified process flow that you might look at, and then we're going to look at some commercial systems before we get into marketing as we get to the end of the presentation. So as a very simplified process flow, so these are pictures I took. This is just this is sort of a windowsill system. This isn't a commercial system, but there's a lot of characteristics even between the smaller scale 10 by 20 flat system and the larger scale systems. There's a lot of commonalities. It's just the production space is obviously different. But just as a very simple process flow for those of you who have never done this, what this might look like is if you're soaking the seeds, you would measure it out, or do your partitioning system for how much what your seeding rate is going to be. You could soak them overnight if that's what you're going to do, but you would have weighed them out first, right? You see in the top left-hand corner, and then once you're ready, you would have filled your media in your tray, tamped it down so it's nice and even. Preferably get that media nice and wet, and then in this case, I just did it by eye and sort of seeded evenly across the flat surface and then watered it again. Now, the next step is where there can be a lot of differentiation between the home DIY version and as you scale up. I, at the small scale, will use like paper towels. And instead of covering it with vermiculite and soil, we'll just cover it with a paper towel, keep that moist, and then put a humidity dome over the top for 2 to 3 days until they germinate. And then once they germinate, I remove the humidity dome, remove the paper towel, and then they take off. The reason why I do that is because if you put soil over the top of vermiculite, some of that soil and vermiculite can cling to the cotyledons and make them a little bit dirty and not quite as clean. So I prefer doing that. On a commercial scale, what people will do is a lot of times they might just cover it with like a sheet of plastic, or they cover it with another flat on top of it, like a white flat with no holes in the bottom, instead of a humidity dome or paper towel, until they germinate. Then they remove that and then let them grow in the production space. So that's kind of really it when you get started. And then you could put them on a heating mat if you have heating mat space. But then as soon as they are actively growing, like in this picture on the right, this is probably the mild microgreen mix at maybe 4 or 5 days. They're really off to the races. And then at 6 or 7 days to 10 days here on the left, they're getting close to that 2 to 3 inch stage and they're ready to harvest. And here on the right hand side in the top picture, this is a flat that's ready to harvest, and then you can see them in their harvested state. So just a real quick sort of flow. And like I said, it's a real quick turnaround time. So this is really attractive production system where you can really control the amount that you're planting and the amount that you're yielding on a weekly basis. So in terms of commercial growing systems, there's a number of different ways you can do it. There's the greenhouse systems. So if you already have a transplant production greenhouse, you're doing some other bench greenhouse system, this microgreens is something you could add on to that operation relatively cheaply because you have the infrastructure in place. If you are using it for your transplant greenhouse, you need to make sure that there's room for both microgreens and transplants if those cycles are overlapping. You don't want to plan for a bunch of microgreen production and then realize, oh, I don't have enough space for my transplants. You need to consider that if you're trying to match those two systems together. Consider focused heat within an inner greenhouse or minimum temperatures they will tolerate for heat savings. We'll look at an example of that in a little bit, of what something like that might look like. Indoors, growing indoors requires an additional investment if you don't have a transplant production greenhouse, but it's usually where a lot of people start on a really small scale. Like I said, you could do the light bench system or some real simple windowsill systems, and then as you start scaling up, you might move to a light bench system. And then at the very upper end of the indoor commercial scale, you have the shipping container modular systems and indoor vertical warehouses. So using multi-layered horizontal benches or stackable pods. Significant capital startup costs with this. These are at the upper end of the indoor commercial operations, and we'll look at a couple examples here in a second. So really quickly, we'll look at a technique Ben Hartman of Clay Bottom Farm, who last year when I did the lean webinar, some of you may have been here for that. He does microgreen production at Clay Bottom Farm, and he has an interesting technique where he's using the paper pot transplanter system for his outdoor production. And if you do the paper pot transplanting system, you have to purchase the special seeding trays and dibbler and a special seeder. And he actually, instead of just using that for his paper pot transplanting system, he's starting to use that dibbler and seeder to speed up and lean up his microgreen production system. So he's filling the trays, with the media, and then using the dibbler that comes with the paper pot transplanter to make these small little holes. And you can see they make this middle picture right here. They make a bunch, hundreds, I think it's like 266 impressions on a 10 by 20 area, and then he's individuating maybe like, a pinch full of seeds in each one of those holes, and he's doing that with the seeder that comes with it. So instead of doing it by hand, he's using the dibbler and tray seeder system from the paper pot transplanter to make it a quicker process. And then he's covering it with vermiculite, like you see here in the bottom right hand picture, which for him, it makes sense because he already uses the paper pot transplanting system, and he can, double his use of that fixed cost with microgreen production as well. This is just an example of what that looks like. So here's him filling trays from his media that he has dropped off, putting them in trays in his little gator, and then bringing them to his seeding space, and then actually putting them out into his greenhouse. So here's an example, the right-hand picture of sort of a greenhouse within a greenhouse, if you're going to do this, where you can direct heat in the colder months just into this specific area to get the ideal germination and growth temperatures just for those trays. And then once they're growing, or the temperature is getting warmer in your transplant area, you can just put them out on your regular bench space. So here's an example of a commercial growing option for indoors. On the left is a hydroponics setup, that soilless felt system. And on the right, here's a tray system and a homemade bench system, where they're just putting the trays underneath the lights, keeping them super close, and doing it in the 10 by 20 trays in a soil media type system on the right. And then there's the large-scale indoor operation. So the indoor vertical operations, the picture on the left, you see this indoor vertical operation using LED lights. This is basil in this picture on float trays, but the same company actually does microgreen production as well on those same float trays. So there's a company called PostHarvest on the right, where they're actually taking shipping containers, kind of doing the same thing in terms of light benching systems, air circulation, AC systems, and just retrofitting them for microgreen production. And then you can, stack them and do this in a multiple contexts. Again, that is an option. Obviously capital intensive to start off this way, but if you want to and you have a market for it, and you want to specifically focus on indoor production, this could be an avenue for you. But most growers who already have transplant production space, or even a hoop house that they might be able to heat, you want to maximize your fixed costs and maybe utilize those spaces at appropriate times versus putting the capital investment into a brand new high-tech system like this. But there are options. So let's talk about harvesting a little bit. So on the right is that same capstone project that I mentioned for that hand roller seeder. That same student developed this automated harvesting system here that you see with this sickle bar mower here. The right-hand picture, where it's a conveyor belt system where the felt pad is being pulled over this roller and over a sickle bar mower that's actually mowing the microgreens off, and it's falling into a bin below. So there are some newer technologies that are being developed. This isn't something that's marketed, it's just an example. But at the small scale, people are definitely starting with scissors and knives, and as you scale up, it's going to be more difficult to do that, more labor intensive. You see folks like Four Season Tools owner Greg Garbos, in his operation, he's using grass shears, handheld electric grass shears to hand harvest. And then we'll see the Farmer's Friend Quick Greens harvester. There's a mounting mechanism for that you can use for microgreens as well. But just some considerations prior to harvest. Make sure microgreens are properly watered and not wilted when you're harvesting them. They need to be have a lot of vigor and turgidity to them before you don't want to harvest them when they're starting to wilt. And obviously determining whether you're harvesting at the cotyledon or first true leaf stage. If you're harvesting in greenhouses, probably best to harvest in the morning or in the evening when it's not too hot, and as soon as you cut, they start to respire and they want to wilt really quickly. Just some considerations for that. In terms of that microgreen stand for the greens harvesters, are some of you familiar with the Quick Greens harvester that Farmer's Friend sells? Jonathan Dysinger is the kid's name who invented that. He also invented this mount that you see here on the sort of edge of the table where you can mount the quick greens harvester to that and run a flat underneath the blade, and the macrame roller pushes the microgreens back into the basket, and then you can tilt this into a bin like you see on the right and harvest a bunch of trays at once really quickly. So this is a way that you can start to scale it up. If you have the quick greens harvester, the mount is another $170. Those quick greens harvesters run about $480. So it's a pretty big investment if you don't already have a greens harvester, but if you're looking to scale up beyond hand harvesting, this might be a good place to start. He's come up with some higher tech versions of a greens harvest, of microgreens harvesters, but he's starting to think that there isn't much of a market for it because they're so expensive to build. It's not quite this right here, but there might not be a market for it for our smaller scale producers. So really quickly before we end on marketing notes and take some of these questions, just wanted to reiterate some post-harvest handling and food safety notes. So some growers wash, some growers don't. So there is nothing in FSMA that mandates that you have to wash your produce. It really depends on how dirty your microgreens get, how you're marketing, and maybe some food safety indications depending on what your systems are set up. Hydroponic growers usually don't wash greens because there's really no soil involved. Washing definitely can help reduce the field heat of the microgreens and prevent wilting. But in terms of, and a little bit of moisture, just like with baby salad greens, is okay for post-harvest and shelf life. But if they're too wet, that can actually promote some rotting conditions and reduce the shelf life. And then additionally, any rough handling and bruising during washing will also decrease shelf life. So I guess the key point here with washing and handling is that the less handling, the better. So you may still want to have a post-harvest washing system for a number of different reasons, but you need to consider that less handling will equal longer shelf life. So typically they're packed into bags, clamshells, deli containers, or sold as whole flat items. Now, a couple people have asked me about markets that only allow unsealed produce, particularly at farm stands. I would check with your local state Department of Health regulations in terms of how you market them, and we'll look at some examples of that in the marketing section in terms of whether you can market it in a closed sealed container or not, and whether a closed clamshell is actually considered a sealed container or not. I would ask your Department of Health that specific question. Keeping them under 41 degrees, as close to their freezing point as possible, so 32 to 36 degrees is ideal. You're really not going to get more than 10 days of good shelf life, even if you are handling them very minimally. So the closer you are to your end user, the better. Again, there's not much in way of research of the safety of microgreens versus sprouts because there haven't been large-scale outbreaks. But again, we talked about how there are differences and there are reduced risks. But again, you want to follow very similar GAP procedures for other produce safety items, testing water, sanitizing trays and seeds if applicable, and worker and health and hygiene practices. And if you're using a soil media and there's manure or amendments of biological soil origin, if they're properly treated to reduce any risk associated with that. So really quickly, we'll go over some marketing considerations, but the most important thing I wanted to talk about is that last bullet, is that don't grow microgreens if you don't think you can sell them. Again, we talked about how the high grosses per square foot, quick ROI. If you have a transplant greenhouse system in place, it's relatively easy to get into microgreen production. But if you don't have a market for them, and you haven't done your market research, you might not want to jump into this because, again, the extra media costs money, and the seed at bulk purchasing levels can cost a lot of money as well. But that being said, these are kind of the three sort of areas to look at in terms of direct to consumer, farmers market. I would really look and see if your market is saturated. Are there other growers selling microgreens? Market customers are definitely more price sensitive to it. It could be a part of a CSA share during the slow time of the season. The high-end restaurants and chefs, or the high-end wholesale ends are normally where people are getting into, where they're making the most money. But again, you need to have quality and reliability when it comes to restaurants. They can command a better price, but chefs may demand more difficult crops. If they're just doing small orders, is that worth your time? If you can get some standing orders or recurring or contracts, that's better and more predictable with microgreens because you can really predict your crop cycles and yields much better than with outdoor produce. There are wholesale options, but lowest price point and you really need to do your numbers and know how to speak retail to get into that level. So there are a few different areas that you can jump into. So you see here that on the right hand side, this is microgreens maybe at a farm stand selling for $20 a pound in a bulk context. So here are some other options. Here's microgreens at a farm stand in open bags, Ziploc bags, right? Here are some options here on the right where folks are marketing in whole trays or whole flats or smaller flats where you're selling the full tray rather than you harvesting it yourself. The consumer is taking it home and harvesting it. And in terms of a freshness and shelf life standpoint, that might actually be a more attractive marketing strategy because if they're harvesting as they need them, then they can get more shelf life out of them. Here's just another example of microgreens grown in little 4-inch pots, and they're selling them for $2, right? So this might be, if you're selling other transplants at the market, other ornamentals, this might be a nice little niche for you to do it this way. And here are microgreens marketed in clamshells. And again, in terms of your specific farmer's market, if there are some regulations about selling in open containers or bags versus sealed containers, you might want to contact your local Department of Health to kind of sort of clarify that specific rule. So in terms of pricing, this is like it really depends how you sell your microgreens is how you price. So if you're doing all the cut, washing, and packaging, it might be a little bit more. If you're doing cut your own trays or selling them as full trays, it might be a little less. So you just really need to track your cost of production, media, seed, packaging, labor, and adjust accordingly. So I've seen ranges anywhere from $20 to $98 a pound. People selling $5 for 2 to 3 ounce clamshells, $5 for 3 to 4 ounce pea shoots at $16 a pound. So there's a big range of how you could price it. I think it depends on your specific marketing outlet and really tracking those production costs and dialing that in. So expenses around $2 to $4 per tray, not including labor. So netting anywhere from $4.25 to $36 per tray, not including labor, is kind of an okay estimate. So here on the right, I think I looked at this grow system on the right and tried to approximate based on some of these numbers what a gross income from the above pick might be, and I got anywhere $400 to $2,500 worth of microgreens, what you're looking at here, depending on your outlet. So it can be very lucrative, but again, you need to do your math, you need to do your market research, and you need to see how it's going to fit in your system before you really jump into this wholeheartedly. So I'll bring this page back up again, but there's a lot of YouTube videos out there about growing microgreens. Curtis Stone, the urban farmer, has a lot of really good videos about how he does microgreen production. I want to leave you with this key takeaway. As you can see, there's many different variations on how you can get started, but I think you really need to ask yourself is how can I get into this as cheaply and simply as possible? Can you piggyback your microgreen production onto your existing production setup, whether that's in your propagation area or if you have a light bench system? Can you integrate this rather than investing in costly infrastructure? And can you even sell the product? Do your market research. So I'll leave you with that key takeaway. Here's my email info down here at the bottom if you have any further questions. And we have a few minutes left, and I can try to answer some questions. For those of you who need to get off the call, by all means do, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can, and we'll record this and post this later. So thank you guys very much.
Woo! Take a breath, big guy. Thank you. That was an incredible amount of information in the space of 55 or so minutes, Zach. Well done. Couple of questions that have popped up. One was regarding hours of light per day. What are your thoughts on indoor production and hours of light?
So I think at a minimum, I've seen people doing 12-12, but I would say somewhere between 14 and 16 is probably better. So you can get a nice light timer for your bench system, preferably one that works. Digital ones are better than those analog ones. They can have issues. But somewhere between 14 and 16 is probably a good measure. And if you do it out, 10.12 to 0.10 cents per kilowatt hour, it amounts to maybe like $20 to $30 per month in electric costs. So not too much, but 14 to 16 hours is probably a good minimum.
Regarding restaurants, do you see them buying fairly large amounts of microgreens? Are they using them in quantity, or is this mostly very small quantity sales for use as garnish?
Right, so I see the garnish. So I think it really depends on the type of restaurant that you're working with. Some of the higher end restaurants might be going through larger volumes than restaurants that have, exec and sous chefs who aren't as familiar with it. So you definitely want to do your research. You definitely want to bring samples to the chefs and kind of get their feedback in terms of what they want and how much they want to use. The one institutional person that I'm looking to work with, we're going to start off with pea shoots for one particular dish, and he's telling me, every time I make the dish, I use about 7 pounds. So for me, I know that that's like slightly less than 10 trays. So if he's doing that once a week, you can start to do the math like that, but really, dial in to that specific market and that specific chef and restaurant and see exactly how much they want and what they want. Because with microgreens, you really know what your yields are going to be super predictable and how often you can bring it to them. You can really get into those numbers and be really exact and reliable, which is what's nice about microgreen production.
That's awesome. That's really good marketing advice. So regarding marketing, what do you see as the trends in the microgreens marketplace? Is there a lot of upward room, or are tons of people already starting up in this?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think some markets are probably starting to get saturated, but I think there's definitely room, particularly if you can do the larger premium wholesale operations in a local area. Because like I said, because of the rough handling that you don't want microgreens to go through, if you can provide a product, like for a chef, one of my ideas was to provide them with the tray of pea shoots and not harvest it myself and just have them harvest it as part of their normal prep work activity. So I think you really need to find, the specific areas that are going to work well in your area. I think the restaurants and then maybe some premium wholesale is probably where to go. But I think it really depends. If at your farmers market, if no one's selling microgreens or shoots, then I think that's an untapped area where you can jump in. But if there's 2 other growers selling the same things, unless you can really differentiate your product, then you might need to look elsewhere. I see someone asking about online microgreen marketing, online sales. Absolutely. I think you could definitely integrate it into it. I just think you really need to look at, what you're doing as far as post-harvest handling, how you're handling it, how you're shipping it, how you're getting it to the producer. But in terms of predictability with online orders, I think it would fit well into that if you have a good logistical system to get the product to the end user. So I really think it's market dependent, and you just need to analyze you really need to do your market research, because this is something that, again, it's easy to get into, but you don't want to invest a lot of capital into specializing in this if you don't think that there's a market there that you can capture. Otherwise, I think if it's just an add-on to your farm stand or your CSA, then, you could start out very, very small and very, very easily and cheaply and just kind of see if it's going to take before really trying to scale it up.
Zach, I think we're going to leave it there. Thanks so much. This has been Zack Grant, local food systems and small farms educator in Cook County for University of Illinois Extension. Thanks for the presentation. Thank everyone for joining us as well. This is a really cool thing that you can put into practice quickly. So do your market research first. I think that's an excellent take-home message. I'll be sending out the link to the archived webinar on the Illinois Local Foods YouTube channel. Please watch also for that 1-minute eval that I tend to send after these things, and let us know what you thought. So until next week, for a lot of you, thanks so much. And Zach, we appreciate your expertise, my friend.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure.
So long, everybody.
Okay. Did you get a